My name is Colt Ramirez. I was a salt mine foreman in Kansas when Yellowstone erupted and triggered an ice age that froze the world in weeks. While everyone else froze to death on the surface, I kept 200 people alive 600 feet underground for 90 days. Raiders tried to kill us. Food ran out. People turned against each other. But I had something they didn't have. I knew how to survive where others couldn't breathe. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comments section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Colt Sebastian Ramirez, and I need to tell you about the 90 days that changed everything. I was 34 years old when the world ended, working as a salt mine foreman at the Compass Minerals facility in Hutchinson, Kansas. For 16 years, I had descended into those tunnels every single day, leading my crew 600 feet beneath the Kansas plains to extract rock salt from deposits that had been forming for millions of years. The mine was my second home, and those tunnels were as familiar to me as the rooms in my house above ground. What I'm about to share with you happened during the summer of 2024. It was July 15th, a Tuesday night, and I was starting my usual shift at 10 o'clock in the evening. The surface temperature that day had reached 96 degrees, typical for a Kansas summer that made working underground almost pleasant by comparison. Down in the mines, the temperature never changed. It stayed at exactly 58 degrees Fahrenheit, winter or summer, day or night. That constant temperature was something we took for granted back then, but it would become the single most important factor in keeping us alive. I had 12 men on my crew that night. Rodriguez was operating the continuous miner, a massive piece of equipment that could chew through salt rock like it was chalk. Martinez was handling communications from our underground station, keeping contact with the surface. The rest of the boys were running the conveyor systems and hauling equipment. These weren't just coworkers to me. After 16 years underground, they were family. We trusted each other with our lives every single day because in a mine, one mistake can kill everyone. The work was routine that night. We were extracting salt from the main chamber, following seams that ran deeper into the earth than most people could imagine. The sound of the machinery echoed through the tunnels the way it had every night for years. There was something comforting about that rhythm, the predictable grinding and hauling that meant everything was working the way it should. We had quotas to meet, safety protocols to follow, and families depending on our paychecks. Around midnight, I was checking the ventilation systems when Martinez came running toward me from the communication station. His face was white as the salt we'd been pulling from the walls, and he was moving faster than I'd ever seen him move in 15 years of working together. The look in his eyes told me something was seriously wrong before he even opened his mouth. "Colt, you need to hear this right now," he shouted over the noise of the machinery. "Something's happening topside. Something real bad." I followed him back to the communication station, where our emergency radio was crackling with transmissions from all over the region. The voices were panicked, talking over each other, and what they were saying didn't make any sense at first. Yellowstone National Park had erupted. Not just any eruption, but what they kept calling a supervolcanic eruption. The kind of event that happens maybe once every 600,000 years. At first, none of us understood what that meant for us in Kansas. Yellowstone was 800 miles northwest of our location. We'd all heard about the geysers and hot springs, maybe seen it in movies, but it seemed as distant and irrelevant as events on another planet. Rodriguez shut down the continuous miner so we could hear the radio better, and we gathered around that crackling speaker like it was going to give us answers we could understand. The reports were coming in from weather stations, emergency services, and amateur radio operators across the western United States. Within hours of the eruption, ash clouds were spreading across Wyoming, Montana, and Colorado. The descriptions were unlike anything in recorded history. Ash columns reaching 30 miles into the atmosphere, pyroclastic flows moving at hundreds of miles per hour, But what caught my attention were the reports from closer to home. Weather stations in Denver were reporting ash fall beginning just 6 hours after the eruption. By dawn, ash was falling across eastern Colorado like gray snow. The radio operators were describing it as fine volcanic particles that got into everything, clogging air filters, shorting out electrical systems, and making it dangerous to breathe without protection. That's when I started to understand we might have a problem. My grandfather had told me stories about Mount St. Helens erupting back in 1980. He was farming wheat in western Kansas at the time, and he said ash from that eruption, which was much smaller than what we were hearing about, had reached Kansas within days. It didn't cause major damage, but it was enough to coat everything with a fine gray dust. If a relatively small eruption could send ash that far, what would a supervolcanic eruption do? By the time our shift ended at 6 in the morning on July 16th, the radio reports were getting worse. Ash was falling across Nebraska and starting to reach the Kansas border. Weather stations were reporting temperature drops of 10 to 15 degrees as the ash clouds blocked sunlight. Commercial flights across the entire western United States had been grounded. Interstate highways were closing as visibility dropped to zero. I made the decision to go topside and see the situation for myself. What I found when I emerged from the mine entrance changed everything I thought I knew about our world. The sky, which should have been bright blue on a summer morning, was the color of old concrete. Fine gray ash was beginning to fall like snow, coating my truck, the mining equipment, and everything else in sight. The air smelled like sulfur and tasted metallic when I breathed it in. The ash wasn't just a curiosity. Within minutes of being outside, I could feel it irritating my lungs and eyes. My truck's air filter was already clogging, and the radio reception was getting worse as the particles interfered with signals. This wasn't something that was going to blow over in a few days. This was the beginning of something catastrophic. I drove home to check on my wife Maria and our teenage daughter Sophia. Maria was glued to the television, watching news reports that were becoming more alarming by the hour. Meteorologists were talking about volcanic winter, a phenomenon where massive eruptions can alter global climate for years. They were showing computer models predicting temperature drops across North America that would make normal agriculture impossible. Sophia was supposed to be visiting her aunt in Denver that week, but thank God Maria had decided to keep her home because of some minor illness. Looking back, that decision probably saved her life. Denver was already reporting several inches of ash accumulation, and emergency services were telling people to stay indoors unless absolutely necessary. The local news was reporting that Hutchinson City Services were preparing for ash fall, but it was clear they had no idea what they were dealing with. They were talking about street cleaning and air quality alerts like this was a temporary weather event. They didn't understand that this was the beginning of a climate catastrophe that would make the surface world uninhabitable. By the afternoon of July 16th, the temperature had dropped 20 degrees from the previous day. Ash was falling steadily across central Kansas, accumulating on roofs and clogging storm drains. The power grid was starting to have problems as ash interfered with transformers and power lines. Cell phone service was becoming unreliable. I called the other shift foremen and told them we needed to have an emergency meeting at the mine. These were men I'd worked with for years, and they trusted my judgment when it came to safety issues. We gathered in the break room 600 feet underground, away from the chaos developing on the surface. "Boys, I don't think we're dealing with a normal situation here," I told them. "This ash is going to keep falling, and it's going to keep getting colder. We need to start thinking about the mine as more than just a workplace." The mine had everything we needed for extended stays underground. We had emergency food supplies, fresh water from deep wells, backup power systems, and most importantly, clean air that was filtered and circulated independent of surface conditions. The tunnels were extensive, with storage areas and equipment bays that could be converted to living spaces if necessary. But what really made me think the mine could be our salvation was that constant 58-degree temperature. No matter what happened on the surface, no matter how cold it got, the deep earth maintained its steady temperature. If the surface world was going to freeze, the mine would remain habitable. I suggested that we contact our families and tell them to prepare for the possibility of staying at the mine for an extended period. Not permanently, I thought at the time, but maybe for weeks or even months until the situation stabilized. The other foremen agreed, and we started making plans to bring families underground if conditions continued to deteriorate. By July 17th, those conditions were deteriorating faster than anyone had predicted. The temperature had dropped another 15 degrees overnight. Ash accumulation was measured in inches now, not just a light dusting. More importantly, the ash was affecting the power grid across the region. Rolling blackouts were becoming common as utility companies struggled to keep equipment running. Maria and Sophia came to the mine that evening, along with the families of most of my crew. We set up temporary sleeping areas in the break rooms and storage areas. The kids thought it was an adventure at first, like camping underground. The adults were more worried, but still hopeful that this was a temporary precaution. The mine's ventilation system was struggling with the ash in the air, but our filtration equipment was designed to handle dust and particles. It was working harder than usual, but it was keeping the air clean underground. We had backup power systems that could run independently of the surface grid, so even when the power went out above ground, we had lights and air circulation below. On July 18th, it snowed in Kansas in the middle of July. Not ash that looked like snow, but actual frozen precipitation. The temperature had dropped below 50 degrees, something that hadn't happened in July in recorded history. The radio reports were describing similar conditions across the entire Midwest. Crops were dying. Livestock were dying. The growing season was over before harvest could begin. That's when I knew we weren't going back to normal anytime soon. This wasn't a temporary weather event. This was a fundamental change in our climate that was happening in real time, faster than anyone thought possible. The surface world as we knew it was ending, and the only safe place was going to be underground. I gathered everyone together in the main tunnel and explained what I thought was happening. The volcanic eruption had put so much ash and debris into the atmosphere that it was blocking sunlight and causing rapid global cooling. This wasn't something that would be fixed in weeks or months. This could last for years. Some people didn't want to believe it. They wanted to go back to their homes, to wait it out on the surface. But as reports came in of temperatures continuing to drop and ash continuing to fall, more people started to understand that the mine might be our only option for survival. By July 20th, the surface temperature had dropped to 40 degrees. Snow was accumulating and not melting. The radio reports were describing similar conditions from Colorado to Ohio. Major cities were losing power as electrical grids failed under the strain of unprecedented demand for heating and the ongoing effects of volcanic ash. We started organizing ourselves like a mining operation because that was what we knew how to do. Everyone had jobs and schedules. We established work shifts for maintaining the mine systems, preparing food, and taking care of the children. The mining safety protocols that had kept us alive underground for years became the foundation for keeping our families alive in this new reality. The mine's storage areas contained enough food and supplies for a few weeks, but we knew we'd need more if this situation continued. I organized teams to make supply runs to the surface, gathering everything we could from abandoned stores and homes. These missions were dangerous because of the ash and cold, but they were necessary for our survival. Martinez maintained radio contact with other facilities and survivor groups across the region. The reports were consistently grim. Surface temperatures were continuing to drop. Snow accumulation was making roads impassable. Most importantly, there was no sign that conditions were going to improve anytime soon. The mine's deep wells provided clean water that wasn't affected by surface contamination. Our backup power systems kept the lights on and the ventilation running. Most critically, that constant 58-degree temperature meant we weren't fighting the cold that was killing people on the surface. By the end of July, 3 weeks after the eruption, we had nearly 40 people living in the mine. Families of miners, neighbors who had nowhere else to go, and a few strangers who had heard about our shelter through radio communications. I found myself making decisions I never thought I'd have to make about who could stay and who we couldn't support with our limited resources. The surface world continued to deteriorate. Radio reports described cities under martial law as governments struggled to provide heating and food for their populations. Supply chains had collapsed as transportation became impossible. The situation wasn't just bad in Kansas. This was happening across North America and around the world. What struck me most during those first few weeks was how quickly everything we thought we knew about normal life became irrelevant. The surface world that had existed for our entire lives was gone, replaced by something hostile and unlivable. But down in the mine, 600 feet below the chaos, we had created a small pocket of stability and safety. The children adapted faster than the adults. They learned to navigate the tunnels, helped with simple tasks, and seemed to accept that this underground world was their new reality. The adults struggled more with the psychological adjustment, but they recognized that the alternative was death on the surface. As August began, I realized we were past the point of this being a temporary situation. The volcanic winter was real, and it was going to last. The surface world was freezing while we remained warm and safe underground. The mine that had been my workplace for 16 years was becoming our permanent home, and I was no longer just a foreman managing salt extraction. I was leading a community of survivors in a world that had fundamentally changed. The radio brought news that other underground facilities across the region were facing similar situations. Some had succeeded in creating viable shelters. Others had failed, leading to tragedy and loss of life. We were among the lucky ones, but I knew our challenges were just beginning. Food supplies wouldn't last forever. More people would seek shelter with us. And eventually, we'd have to deal with others who might see our resources as something worth taking by force. What I'm about to tell you next changed everything we thought we knew about survival and what people will do when civilization collapses around them. By August 1st, our small community of 40 people had grown to over 60 as more families arrived seeking shelter from the frozen wasteland above. Word was spreading through radio communications that the Compass Minerals facility was accepting survivors, and people were making desperate journeys across the snow-covered plains to reach us. Each new arrival brought stories that confirmed what we already knew. The surface world was dying, and we were among the few places where people could still survive. The mine's layout was perfect for expansion, something I'd never appreciated during my 16 years working there. The main tunnels branched into dozens of smaller passages, storage chambers, and equipment bays that could be converted into living spaces. We had mining equipment that could excavate new areas when needed, and most importantly, we had the expertise to do it safely. Every modification we made had to account for structural integrity and ventilation, skills that my crew had developed over years of underground work. I established work schedules based on mining shift rotations because that's what everyone understood. People needed structure and purpose, especially when their entire world had been turned upside down. The morning shift focused on expansion and construction, using our mining equipment to create new sleeping areas and storage spaces. The afternoon shift handled food preparation, childcare, and maintenance of our essential systems. The night shift managed security and radio communications, keeping watch over our community while others slept. Food rationing became my biggest challenge during those early weeks of August. Our original emergency supplies had been designed to support a mining crew for a few days, not multiple families for an indefinite period. I had to make decisions about portions and distribution that affected every person in our community. Adults got smaller portions, so children could maintain their full nutritional needs. People doing heavy physical labor got slightly more than those doing lighter work. These weren't easy choices, but they were necessary for our long-term survival. The mine's ventilation system was working harder than it ever had, but it was holding up under the increased demand. We were filtering air for 60 people instead of 12, and the surface contamination from volcanic ash made the system work overtime. I kept thinking about what would happen if that system failed. We'd have to evacuate to the surface, which by early August meant certain death. The outside temperature had dropped to 20 degrees, with several feet of snow and ash covering everything. Martinez had established regular radio contact with other survivor groups across Kansas and neighboring states. The reports were consistently devastating. Cities like Wichita and Kansas City were under martial law as governments struggled to provide heating fuel and food for their populations. Rural communities were mostly abandoned as people fled to larger cities seeking resources. Most disturbing were the reports of groups turning violent, raiding other shelters and taking resources by force. One radio transmission that stuck with me came from a group holed up in a school basement near Salina. They had started with 30 people, but were down to 15 after conflicts over food distribution. The group had split apart, with some members leaving to find other shelters while others had been forced out after disagreements turned physical. It was a warning about what could happen to our own community if we didn't maintain discipline and unity. The psychological pressure was affecting everyone differently. Some people adapted quickly to underground life, finding comfort in the routine and safety of our tunnel system. Others struggled with claustrophobia and depression, missing the sunlight and open spaces they'd never see again. I spent a lot of time talking to people individually, trying to keep morale up and resolve conflicts before they became serious problems. Children were actually adjusting better than adults in many ways. Sophia and the other teenagers had created games that involved navigating the tunnel system, and they were learning practical skills like radio operation and basic mining safety. The younger kids saw it as an extended adventure, though they sometimes asked when they could go home. Those questions were the hardest to answer because home no longer existed. By mid-August, we had expanded our living space to accommodate 80 people. New families were arriving almost daily, and each addition strained our resources further. I had to make the difficult decision to start turning people away unless they could contribute skills or resources that our community needed. It was heartbreaking to send desperate families back into the frozen wasteland, but I had to think about the survival of the people already under my protection. The mining equipment proved invaluable for more than just excavation. We used hauling trucks to transport supplies from surface raids, bulldozers to clear snow from our entrances, and drilling equipment to improve our ventilation system. Most importantly, we had explosives and the expertise to use them safely. I knew that capability might become crucial if we had to defend ourselves or modify our underground layout quickly. Food acquisition became an increasingly dangerous challenge as August progressed. The easy targets like grocery stores and restaurants had already been cleaned out by other survivor groups or buried under snow. We had to venture further from the mine to find supplies, which meant longer exposure to the deadly surface conditions. I organized these raids like mining safety operations, with detailed plans, backup procedures, and constant radio contact. During one supply run to an abandoned farming supply store, Rodriguez discovered something that would prove crucial later. The store had large quantities of salt for livestock, which wasn't immediately useful for food but had other applications. Salt could be used for preserving meat, melting ice, and most importantly, as a trade commodity with other survivor groups. We loaded several tons into our hauling trucks, not knowing how valuable that decision would prove to be. Radio communications brought news of a group calling themselves the Reapers who were moving across Kansas, forcing their way into shelters and taking whatever they wanted. Their method was simple but effective. They would surround a facility, demand entry and resources, and use violence against anyone who resisted. Several shelters had been completely taken over, with the original inhabitants either killed or forced to join the Reapers under threat of death. The descriptions of their operations were chilling. They traveled in a convoy of modified vehicles equipped for winter conditions, and they had enough manpower to overwhelm most survivor groups. What made them particularly dangerous was their willingness to use extreme violence to achieve their goals. They weren't just taking supplies. They were taking control of entire communities and forcing survivors to work for them under brutal conditions. Martinez intercepted radio transmissions that suggested the Reapers were mapping the locations of survivor groups across the region. They were being systematic about their expansion, targeting facilities with the best resources and strategic positions. Our mine, with its defensible position and valuable salt deposits, would eventually attract their attention. I started planning defensive measures using my knowledge of mining operations and explosives. The mine's layout gave us significant advantages if we had to fight. There were only a few entrances, which could be controlled or sealed if necessary. The tunnel system was complex enough that intruders would have difficulty navigating without guidance. Most importantly, we had access to mining explosives and the expertise to use them for creating barriers or collapsing specific sections if needed. The ventilation crisis hit us on August 25th, just as we were approaching our maximum sustainable population of 100 people. The surface air intake system had been struggling with volcanic ash since the beginning, but the accumulation of snow and debris finally caused a complete blockage. Within hours, the air quality underground started to deteriorate rapidly. I led an emergency team to the surface to clear the intake vents, a mission that required exposure to conditions that had killed countless people across the region. The surface temperature was 15 degrees below zero, with wind whipping volcanic ash and snow into storms that reduced visibility to zero. We had to work in shifts of 15 minutes each to avoid hypothermia and lung damage from the contaminated air. What we found on the surface was a landscape that looked like another planet. Snow and ash had accumulated to depths of 15 to 20 feet, completely burying cars, small buildings, and anything else that hadn't been tall enough to stay above the accumulation. The familiar farmland around our facility was unrecognizable, transformed into a gray and white wasteland that stretched to the horizon. The intake vents required several hours of work to clear completely, and we had to install new filters and protective covers to prevent immediate recontamination. During that operation, I saw smoke columns rising in the distance, evidence that other groups were still active in the area. Some of those fires might have been from survivor communities trying to stay warm, but others could have been from hostile groups like the Reapers. After we restored ventilation, I realized how vulnerable we were to infrastructure failures. Our entire survival depended on systems that could be damaged by surface conditions or by hostile actions. I started planning backup systems and alternative solutions for every critical component of our underground community. We needed redundancy in everything from air circulation to food storage to communication equipment. The radio brought disturbing news during the last week of August. The Reapers had taken control of a large agricultural facility near Dodge City, and they were using it as a base for operations across western Kansas. More importantly, they had captured several amateur radio operators and were using them to monitor communications between survivor groups. Our radio conversations might not be as private as we'd assumed. I made the decision to implement radio silence protocols, limiting our communications to essential messages and using code words for sensitive information. We also started posting guards at our entrances around the clock, something we hadn't needed before but was becoming necessary as more dangerous groups moved through the region. Population management became critical as we approached 100 residents. We were at the limit of what our food supplies and living space could support sustainably. I had to establish strict criteria for accepting new arrivals, prioritizing people with useful skills like medical training, mechanical expertise, or agricultural knowledge. It was painful to turn away desperate families, but I had to think about the long-term survival of our existing community. The psychological toll of these decisions was enormous. I went from being a mining foreman focused on salt extraction quotas to being responsible for life-and-death choices that affected dozens of families. Some people questioned my authority to make these decisions, leading to heated discussions about leadership and democracy in our underground community. I tried to involve others in decision-making when possible, but ultimately someone had to take responsibility for the hard choices. Food preservation became a crucial skill as we started processing meat from livestock that had died on the surface. The salt we'd accumulated from our mining operations and supply raids proved invaluable for curing meat and extending our food supplies. We also started sprouting seeds in underground growing areas, using mining lights to provide the energy that plants needed without sunlight. By early September, radio reports indicated that the Reapers were expanding their territory and becoming more aggressive in their takeover operations. They had absorbed several smaller groups and were now operating like a military organization with coordinated attacks and strategic planning. Their success was encouraging other hostile groups to adopt similar tactics across the region. The mine's tunnel system connected to several other underground facilities in the area, something I'd known about from old mining surveys but hadn't considered important until now. These connections were mostly sealed or flooded, but they could potentially be reopened if we needed escape routes or alternative positions. I started reviewing the old maps and planning how we might use these connections if we had to abandon our current location. Martinez established contact with a group of survivors at a grain elevator facility about 30 miles away. They had managed to create a stable community of about 50 people, and they were interested in establishing trade relationships. They had large quantities of stored grain but lacked salt for food preservation. We had excess salt but needed more carbohydrates and protein. It was the beginning of what would become a crucial trade network. The first trading expedition took place in early September, with a convoy of our mining trucks traveling across the frozen landscape to exchange salt for grain and preserved meat. The journey was dangerous, requiring navigation across terrain that had been completely transformed by snow and volcanic ash accumulation. But it was successful, and it proved that cooperation between survivor groups was possible even in these desperate conditions. What worried me most was that successful trading expeditions would attract attention from groups like the Reapers. Our trucks and our supplies made us a valuable target, and our growing reputation as a stable community would eventually reach the wrong people. I knew we were buying time with these trading relationships, but we were also increasing our visibility to hostile groups. The mine's strategic value was becoming more apparent every day. We had defensible positions, essential resources, and the expertise to maintain underground operations indefinitely. But those same advantages made us a target for anyone who wanted to control the region's resources. I started planning for the possibility that we'd have to fight for our survival, not just against the harsh conditions, but against other people who wanted what we had built. As September progressed, the radio traffic increased with reports of conflicts between survivor groups. Resources were becoming scarcer as the easy sources of food and fuel were exhausted. Groups that had coexisted peacefully during the early weeks of the crisis were now competing violently for the same supplies. The cooperative phase of the survival period was ending, and the predatory phase was beginning. I knew that our peaceful existence in the mine was temporary. We had created something valuable in a world where value was measured in survival, and eventually someone would try to take it from us. The question wasn't whether we'd have to defend ourselves, but when and against whom. Everything we were doing during those late August and early September days was preparation for a fight that was coming whether we wanted it or not. The children were growing up faster than they should have, learning skills and facing realities that no child should have to experience. But they were also becoming part of our survival community, contributing to our work and understanding their role in keeping everyone alive. Their adaptation gave me hope that human beings could survive this catastrophe and eventually rebuild something better. By the middle of September, we had established a sustainable community of 98 people living in the mine's expanded tunnel system. We had food production, water supply, power generation, and defensive capabilities that made us one of the more successful survivor groups in the region. But success in a collapsed world makes you a target, and I could see the signs that our time of peaceful development was coming to an end. What I didn't know was that our radio communications had been monitored for weeks, and our location had been marked on maps that were being passed between hostile groups across Kansas. Our reputation for stability and resources had spread further than we realized, and decisions were being made by people we'd never met about what to do with the valuable facility we'd created. The calm period of building our underground community was about to end, and we were going to face challenges that would test everything we'd learned about survival and cooperation during those crucial first weeks underground. The food crisis hit us hard during the third week of September. Our careful rationing system that had sustained 98 people through August was failing as our stored supplies dwindled faster than we could replenish them through surface raids and trading expeditions. I had to make the devastating decision to reduce everyone's daily calorie intake to bare survival levels, cutting portions by another 20% across the board. Adults were getting roughly 1,200 calories per day, barely enough to maintain basic functions, while children received their full portions to ensure proper development. The psychological impact of hunger was affecting our community in ways I hadn't anticipated. People who had been cooperative and reasonable during the earlier weeks were becoming irritable and confrontational. Arguments broke out over work assignments, resource distribution, and living space allocation. I found myself mediating disputes that would have been unthinkable when people's basic needs were being met. Hunger was revealing the worst aspects of human nature, even among people who had been working together successfully for months. Rodriguez approached me during the morning shift on September 22nd with information that changed everything. He'd been monitoring radio frequencies and had intercepted communications from a group that was definitely not friendly. They were calling themselves the Reapers, the same group Martinez had been tracking for weeks, and they were getting close to our area. More disturbing was that they seemed to know specific details about our facility, including our approximate population, and the fact that we had valuable salt reserves. The intercepted transmissions indicated that the Reapers had been systematically gathering intelligence about survivor groups across central Kansas. They weren't just randomly raiding facilities. They were conducting organized reconnaissance and planning coordinated attacks against the most valuable targets. Our mine, with its defensible position, extensive tunnel system, and resource production capability, was exactly the kind of facility they wanted to control. I called an emergency meeting of our senior people to discuss the threat. These were the men and women who had emerged as leaders during our months underground. People like Martinez, who handled communications, Rodriguez, who managed our equipment, and several others who had proven themselves reliable during crisis situations. We gathered in the main tunnel after the day's shift had finished, and I laid out what we knew about the approaching danger. The Reapers operated differently from other hostile groups we'd heard about. Instead of hit-and-run raids for supplies, they were taking permanent control of facilities and enslaving the survivors. Their method was to surround a target, demand surrender, and use overwhelming force against anyone who resisted. They had absorbed several smaller raider groups and now commanded over 50 armed individuals with military-style organization and equipment. What made them particularly dangerous was their willingness to use extreme violence to achieve their objectives. Radio reports from other survivor groups described executions of community leaders who refused to cooperate, and forced labor conditions that killed people through overwork and malnutrition. The Reapers weren't interested in coexistence or cooperation. They wanted complete control, and they were willing to kill anyone who stood in their way. I started planning our defensive strategy using everything I'd learned about mining safety and tunnel operations over 16 years underground. The mine's layout gave us significant advantages that most surface facilities didn't have. We had only 3 main entrances, all of which could be controlled or sealed using mining explosives. The tunnel system was complex enough that intruders would have difficulty navigating without local knowledge, and we could use that confusion to our advantage. The mining equipment became crucial to our defensive preparations. We used bulldozers to create barriers and obstacles around our entrances, positioning them to channel any attacking force into predetermined kill zones. The hauling trucks were loaded with supplies and positioned in secondary tunnels where they could be used for rapid evacuation if necessary. Most importantly, we had access to industrial explosives and the expertise to use them for collapsing tunnel sections or creating impassable barriers. Food rationing became even more critical as we prepared for a potential siege. If the Reapers surrounded our facility, we might be cut off from surface supply raids for weeks or even months. I implemented emergency rationing protocols that reduced everyone's intake to absolute survival minimums, conserving every possible calorie for the ordeal ahead. People understood the necessity, but hunger was making everyone desperate and short-tempered. The tunnel connections to other underground facilities that I discovered in the old mining surveys became our potential escape routes. Most of these passages had been sealed or flooded decades ago, but Rodriguez and his crew started working to reopen selected connections that led away from our main facility. If we had to abandon our current position, these tunnels could allow us to evacuate our people without being detected by surface forces. Radio communications became increasingly dangerous as we realized the Reapers were monitoring survivor group transmissions. Martinez implemented strict communication protocols, limiting our broadcasts to essential information and using code words for sensitive topics. We also started using different frequencies and transmission schedules to make it harder for hostile groups to track our location and activities. The psychological preparation was as important as the physical defenses. Many of our people had never experienced violence or warfare, and the prospect of fighting for their lives was terrifying. I organized training sessions using mining safety protocols adapted for combat situations. We practiced tunnel navigation in darkness, emergency evacuation procedures, and basic defensive tactics that took advantage of our underground environment. Children were the most vulnerable part of our community, and protecting them became our highest priority. We identified the deepest and most secure areas of the mine where non-combatants could shelter during an attack. These positions were stocked with food, water, and medical supplies, and connected to our backup ventilation systems. If the worst happened, the children and elderly would have the best chance of surviving even if the rest of us didn't make it. The first direct contact with the Reapers came on October 2nd, exactly 40 days after the radio intercepts had warned us of their approach. A small group of scouts appeared near our main entrance, observing our facility and testing our security procedures. They didn't approach directly, but they made sure we saw them. It was psychological warfare, letting us know they were watching and evaluating our defenses. Rodriguez spotted them first during his morning patrol of the surface perimeter. 3 individuals with military-style equipment and winter camouflage, positioned about 500 yards from our main entrance, where they could observe our activities without being in immediate danger. They stayed for several hours, clearly mapping our layout and security measures, before disappearing back into the frozen landscape. The appearance of scouts meant the main force wasn't far behind. Based on reports from other survivor groups, the Reapers typically conducted reconnaissance for several days before launching their main assault. This gave us time to complete our defensive preparations, but it also meant living under the constant stress of knowing an attack was imminent. I made the difficult decision to seal 2 of our 3 main entrances using controlled explosives, leaving only the primary entrance operational. This limited our escape options, but it also concentrated our defensive resources and eliminated the possibility of multi-directional attacks. The sealed entrances could be reopened later if we survived, but for now, controlling access was more important than maintaining flexibility. The community's mood shifted dramatically once people understood we were actually going to be attacked. Some individuals wanted to surrender immediately, believing that cooperation with the Reapers was better than fighting and risking everyone's lives. Others advocated for aggressive preemptive strikes against the scouts before the main force arrived. I had to maintain unity and discipline while dealing with fear and desperation that threatened to tear our community apart. Food distribution became a source of constant tension as hunger affected everyone's judgment and patience. People who had been reasonable and cooperative for months were now arguing over every morsel, accusing others of taking more than their share, and questioning my authority to make rationing decisions. I had to establish strict rules about meal times and portions, with severe consequences for anyone who violated the protocols. The radio traffic during early October painted a grim picture of survivor communities across the region. The Reapers had successfully taken control of at least 6 major facilities, and their growing resources and manpower were making them increasingly bold in their operations. They were no longer just raiding for supplies. They were establishing a territorial empire based on forced labor and resource extraction from conquered communities. Martinez intercepted a transmission that revealed the Reapers' specific plans for our facility. They wanted to use the mine as a regional headquarters because of its defensible position and valuable salt production capability. But they also planned to eliminate anyone they considered a potential threat to their authority, which included most of our current leadership. This wasn't going to be a negotiation or a takeover. This was going to be a war of extermination. The tunnel system's complexity became our greatest defensive asset as we prepared for the coming assault. We had dozens of secondary passages, storage areas, and equipment bays that could be used for ambush positions or fallback points. The Reapers might have superior numbers and firepower, but they would be fighting in an environment we knew intimately while they struggled to navigate unfamiliar underground terrain. Our mining equipment was repositioned to serve multiple defensive purposes. Bulldozers and hauling trucks blocked key passages while remaining mobile enough to be relocated as needed. Drilling equipment was positioned to create new barriers or escape routes quickly. Most importantly, we had explosives placed at critical structural points where tunnel collapses could stop advancing enemies or seal off compromised areas. The ventilation system that had kept us alive for months could also be used as a weapon if necessary. We could introduce smoke or other deterrents into specific tunnel sections, or shut down air circulation to areas controlled by enemies. The Reapers would need our technical expertise to maintain the mine's life support systems, which gave us some leverage even if they managed to capture parts of the facility. Water supplies became another critical concern as we prepared for siege conditions. The mine's deep wells provided clean water that couldn't be contaminated by surface forces, but the distribution system could be damaged during fighting. We filled every available container with water and positioned emergency supplies throughout our defensive positions to ensure access even if main lines were cut. Medical preparation was handled by the few people in our community who had healthcare training. We established aid stations in protected areas of the mine, stocked with supplies from our trading expeditions and surface raids. Battlefield medicine was very different from normal healthcare, and we practiced procedures for treating traumatic injuries under combat conditions with limited resources. The psychological warfare escalated during the second week of October as more Reaper scouts appeared around our facility. They were being deliberately visible, letting us know we were surrounded and being watched constantly. It was designed to break our morale and encourage surrender before the actual fighting began. Some of our people were cracking under the pressure, becoming convinced that resistance was hopeless and we should negotiate while we still could. I had to make speeches to maintain community unity, explaining why surrender wasn't an option based on what had happened to other survivor groups. The Reapers didn't honor agreements or show mercy to people who cooperated. They used forced labor until people died from overwork, and they eliminated anyone who might organize resistance later. Fighting was dangerous, but surrender was guaranteed death for many of us. The food situation continued to deteriorate, as our reduced rations weren't sufficient to maintain people's strength for the physical demands of defensive preparations. We were burning more calories preparing for battle than we were consuming in our daily meals. Hunger was affecting everyone's judgment, reaction times, and ability to work together effectively. I knew we were approaching the limits of what the community could endure. October 15th brought the first direct confrontation with Reaper forces. A delegation of 5 individuals approached our main entrance under what appeared to be a flag of truce, demanding to speak with our leadership about surrender terms. It was the moment we'd been preparing for, but it was also the point of no return. Whatever happened during that meeting would determine whether our community survived or joined the growing list of facilities under Reaper control. I went to the surface with Martinez and Rodriguez to hear what they had to say, knowing it was probably a trap, but understanding that we needed to buy time to complete our defensive preparations. The Reaper representatives were exactly what I'd expected based on radio reports. Well-armed, organized, and completely confident in their ability to take whatever they wanted through force. Their leader introduced himself only as commander and laid out terms that weren't really negotiations. We would surrender all weapons and supplies, accept Reaper authority over the facility, and provide our technical expertise to maintain mining operations under their control. In exchange, they promised that cooperative individuals would be allowed to live and work under the new management. Anyone who resisted would be eliminated immediately. I told them we needed time to discuss their offer with our community, knowing full well that we had no intention of surrendering, but hoping to delay their attack for a few more days. The commander agreed to give us 48 hours to reach a decision, but he made it clear that any hostile actions during that period would result in an immediate assault with no further opportunities for peaceful resolution. As they walked back toward their positions in the frozen landscape, I knew we had reached the end of our peaceful existence in the mine. Everything we had built over the past months was about to be tested in the most brutal way possible. The community that had survived the Ice Age apocalypse was now going to find out if we could survive other human beings who wanted to destroy what we had created. The next 48 hours would determine whether our underground refuge remained a sanctuary for survivors or became another conquered territory in the Reaper's growing empire of forced labor and violence. We had done everything possible to prepare for this moment, but preparation could only take us so far. The rest would depend on courage, unity, and the willingness to fight for our right to exist as free people in a world that had seemingly abandoned the concept of human dignity. What happened next would either prove that cooperation and community could survive even the worst catastrophes, or demonstrate that civilization's collapse inevitably leads to rule by the most ruthless and violent among us. The 48-hour deadline expired at dawn on October 17th, and the Reapers kept their word about launching an immediate assault. Their attack began with a coordinated strike against our main entrance, using vehicles and heavy weapons they'd acquired from previous raids on other survivor communities. But what they didn't understand was that we had spent those final 2 days completing preparations that would turn their advantages against them. The first phase of their assault focused on the surface installations around our mine entrance. They brought modified trucks equipped with plows to clear snow barriers, and they had enough manpower to overwhelm any surface defenses we might have attempted. But we weren't defending the surface. Everything valuable was 600 feet underground, and we had no intention of fighting them where they held every advantage. I watched their approach from our underground command post, monitoring their movements through periscope systems we'd rigged using mining equipment. The Reapers had at least 50 armed individuals, exactly what our intelligence had suggested, and they were operating with military precision that indicated experienced leadership. They weren't just raiders. They were an organized army that had been conquering survivor communities across Kansas for months. Their commander made a critical mistake during those first hours by assuming we would defend our position the way surface facilities had to defend theirs. He deployed his forces in standard assault formations designed to overwhelm fixed positions and break through defensive lines. But underground warfare follows completely different rules, and our tunnel system was about to become their worst nightmare. The Reapers managed to breach our main entrance by mid-morning, using explosives to blast through the barriers we'd constructed with mining equipment. But instead of finding a desperate community huddled in terror, they encountered the first of many unpleasant surprises we'd prepared for them. The entrance tunnel had been rigged with controlled demolitions that could seal off sections and create choke points where their numerical advantage became meaningless. Rodriguez triggered the first tunnel collapse as the lead elements of their assault force reached the 100-foot level. The explosion brought down enough rock and debris to block the main passage completely, trapping the advance team underground while cutting off reinforcement from the surface. It was a tactic we'd adapted from mining safety procedures, using controlled collapses to contain dangerous situations and protect personnel in unaffected areas. The trapped Reaper advance team found themselves in an environment they couldn't navigate without our expertise. The mine's tunnel system was complex enough that experienced miners sometimes got lost, and these intruders were trying to fight their way through passages they'd never seen before while dealing with darkness, confusion, and the growing realization that they were completely cut off from their support elements. We had positioned ourselves in defensive positions throughout the tunnel system, using our knowledge of every passage and chamber to create ambush points where small numbers of defenders could hold off much larger attacking forces. The mining equipment that had expanded our living space over the past months now served as mobile barriers and weapon platforms that could be repositioned as needed to respond to changing tactical situations. Martinez coordinated our defensive efforts using the mine's communication system, which had been designed to keep work crews in contact across the entire underground facility. We could communicate instantly between any positions in the tunnel network, while the Reapers were reduced to shouting or sending runners through passages they didn't understand. Information is the most important weapon in underground warfare, and we controlled all of it. The second wave of their assault came 3 hours after the first tunnel collapse, with the Reapers attempting to clear the blocked passage using heavy equipment they'd brought for exactly this purpose. But we had anticipated that response and prepared additional surprises that would make their excavation efforts extremely costly. Every time they cleared one obstacle, they encountered another trap designed to inflict casualties and delay their advance. Our food rationing had weakened everyone over the previous weeks, but adrenaline and desperation were providing energy that normal nutrition couldn't supply. People who had been barely functional due to hunger were now fighting with intensity that surprised even me. The threat of slavery or death under Reaper control was motivating our community in ways that speeches and leadership never could have achieved. The children and elderly had been evacuated to the deepest sections of the mine, areas that were connected to our backup ventilation systems and stocked with emergency supplies. These positions were over 800 feet underground, accessible only through passages that would take hours to reach even if the Reapers managed to break through our defensive lines. The non-combatants would be safe regardless of what happened to the rest of us. By afternoon, the Reapers had managed to establish a foothold in the upper levels of the mine, but their advance had cost them heavily in casualties and equipment. The tunnel fighting was unlike anything they'd experienced in their previous conquests of surface facilities. Every passage could contain an ambush, every chamber could be a trap, and they were advancing into an environment where we held every possible advantage. The mine's ventilation system became a weapon when we started using it to channel smoke and other deterrents into areas controlled by Reaper forces. They needed breathable air to continue their assault, but we could make specific tunnel sections uninhabitable while maintaining clean air in our defensive positions. It was another adaptation of mining safety procedures, using controlled airflow to manage dangerous conditions underground. Water became a tactical consideration as the fighting continued into the evening. The Reapers needed access to our water supplies to sustain their assault, but we had positioned defensive posts at every major distribution point. They could take individual tunnel sections, but they couldn't gain control of the resources necessary to hold those positions for extended periods. The psychological impact of underground fighting was affecting the Reaper assault force in ways their leadership hadn't anticipated. Surface warfare allows retreating forces to see escape routes and open sky, but tunnel fighting creates claustrophobic conditions where trapped soldiers can panic and lose effectiveness. Several Reaper teams abandoned their positions and fled back toward the surface rather than continue advancing through our defensive maze. Night brought new challenges as the battle continued in complete darkness throughout most of the tunnel system. We had backup lighting systems powered by our underground generators, but we controlled when and where those lights operated. The Reapers were fighting blind in many areas, using flashlights and portable equipment that made them easy targets while revealing nothing about our positions. Martinez received radio transmissions, indicating that other Reaper units were positioning around our sealed secondary entrances, trying to find alternative ways into the mine. But those entrances had been collapsed using techniques that would require major excavation equipment and weeks of work to reopen. The Reapers were committed to their assault through the main entrance whether they wanted to be or not. The second day of fighting began with the Reapers attempting a desperate push to reach our primary living areas, using concentrated attacks against our strongest defensive positions. They had realized that their usual tactics weren't working in the underground environment, and they were trying to end the battle quickly before their casualties became unsustainable. Rodriguez organized a counterattack using our mining vehicles as mobile assault platforms. The hauling trucks and bulldozers that had moved salt and expanded our tunnels were now serving as armored vehicles in underground combat. We could move these machines through passages the Reapers couldn't navigate on foot, attacking their positions from unexpected directions, and then withdrawing before they could respond effectively. The mine's structural integrity became a concern as explosions and heavy fighting damaged support systems that had been designed for industrial operations, not warfare. We had to balance defensive tactics with the need to preserve the facility that kept us alive. Tunnel collapses that stopped Reaper advances also reduced our own mobility and could potentially damage critical systems like ventilation and water distribution. Food and ammunition supplies were running critically low by the third day, forcing us to make difficult decisions about sustaining our defensive efforts. The emergency stockpiles we'd accumulated during months of preparation were being consumed faster than anticipated, and we couldn't resupply during active combat operations. Every shot fired and every meal consumed brought us closer to the point where continued resistance would become impossible. The Reapers were facing similar supply problems as their assault stretched into its third day. They had planned for a quick victory followed by exploitation of captured resources, not for extended siege warfare in underground conditions. Their forces were exhausted, demoralized, and running low on the supplies necessary to continue offensive operations against determined defenders in prepared positions. The breakthrough moment came when Rodriguez discovered that one of the sealed secondary entrances could be opened from the inside without major excavation. The original collapse had been less complete than we'd realized, and with careful work, we could create an escape route that would allow us to evacuate our people if the main tunnel system became untenable. I made the decision to begin evacuating non-essential personnel through the reopened passage while maintaining defensive positions to cover their withdrawal. It was a calculated risk that could save lives if the evacuation succeeded, but it would also reduce our defensive capability at a critical moment in the battle. Leadership often means choosing between bad options and hoping you've picked the least terrible one. The children were evacuated first, guided through passages they'd learned during months of underground life to safety points over a mile from the main fighting. Their knowledge of the tunnel system was crucial for navigation in darkness, and their small size allowed them to move through areas that would be difficult for adults to traverse. Within 12 hours, every child in our community was safely away from the combat zone. The Reapers detected our evacuation efforts on the fourth day and attempted to intercept the escaping civilians, but they couldn't navigate the complex tunnel connections quickly enough to cut off our escape routes. Their forces were committed to the main assault and couldn't be repositioned effectively to deal with activities in secondary tunnel systems they'd never mapped or explored. Martinez coordinated our final defensive stand using the mine's communication systems to ensure that every defensive position knew when to withdraw and which routes to use for evacuation. We had practiced these procedures during our preparation phase, but executing them under combat conditions while maintaining resistance to the Reaper assault required precision and courage that tested everyone involved. The explosion that ended the siege was my decision alone, and it's something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. We had rigged the main tunnel system with enough mining explosives to create a controlled collapse that would permanently seal the primary access routes to our underground facility. It would stop the Reaper assault, but it would also trap any of our people who hadn't completed their evacuation. I waited until the last possible moment, confirming that our people were clear and that the Reaper forces were concentrated in the areas that would be affected by the collapse. The explosion brought down thousands of tons of rock and debris, sealing the main tunnel system and trapping the surviving Reaper assault force in passages they couldn't escape from without equipment and expertise they didn't possess. The silence that followed the explosion was unlike anything we'd experienced during months of underground life. The constant noise of ventilation systems, machinery, and human activity was replaced by absolute quiet as dust settled, and the reality of what had happened became clear. The mine that had been our home and salvation was now a tomb for our enemies and a closed chapter in our survival story. We regrouped at emergency rally points over 2 miles from the collapsed main facility, in tunnel sections connected to our backup ventilation and supply systems. 91 of our 98 people had survived the evacuation, a success rate that was almost miraculous considering the circumstances. But we had lost our home, most of our equipment, and the secure base that had allowed us to survive the Ice Age apocalypse. The Reaper threat was eliminated, but we now faced the challenge of rebuilding our community in a new location with limited resources and winter conditions that continued to worsen on the surface. The victory had come at a cost that would affect our survival prospects for months to come, but we had preserved the most important thing we possessed. We had kept our people free and maintained the community bonds that made survival possible. Radio communications revealed that other survivor groups had heard about our successful defense against the Reapers, and some were interested in establishing contact and mutual support agreements. Our reputation as a community that could resist hostile takeover attempts was spreading, which brought both opportunities for cooperation and attention from other groups that might see us as a threat to their own territorial ambitions. The explosion had served another purpose beyond stopping the immediate assault. It had demonstrated to other predatory groups in the region that attacking our community would be extremely costly even if they succeeded. The Reapers had been the most powerful hostile force in central Kansas, and their destruction would deter other groups from attempting similar operations against us. But our new position was less defensible than the main mine facility, and we would have to develop different strategies for long-term security in a location that hadn't been designed for extended habitation. The tunnel sections we now occupied were smaller, with limited expansion possibilities and backup systems that couldn't support our full population indefinitely. The battle had changed everyone who participated in it, creating bonds forged under extreme stress and trauma that would define our community relationships for years to come. People who had never imagined they could take human lives had done exactly that to protect their families and neighbors. The psychological aftermath of that experience would affect our community in ways we were only beginning to understand. As we settled into our new temporary home in the backup tunnel systems, I realized that surviving the Reaper assault was just the beginning of our next phase of challenges. We had proven that our community could fight and win against overwhelming odds, but we still had to survive the continuing Ice Age conditions and rebuild our resource base in a hostile world where cooperation was rare and violence was common. The foundation we had built during our first months underground had been tested in the most extreme way possible, and it had held. But now, we faced the challenge of using that foundation to create something even stronger and more resilient in our new circumstances. The aftermath of the Reaper siege left us in secondary tunnel systems that were never designed to support 91 people for extended periods. These backup passages had been excavated decades earlier as emergency routes and equipment storage areas, not as permanent living spaces. We were 800 feet underground in sections that connected to the main mine through passages that were now sealed forever under thousands of tons of collapsed rock and debris. Our first priority was establishing basic survival systems in our new location. The backup ventilation equipment was functional but operating at maximum capacity to provide breathable air for our population. We had emergency water supplies, but the distribution system was primitive compared to what we developed in the main facility. Most critically, our food stores had been reduced to whatever we'd managed to evacuate during the battle, which meant we had perhaps 2 weeks of supplies for our entire community. Martinez immediately began working to establish radio communications from our new position, using portable equipment we'd salvaged during the evacuation. The first transmissions we received painted a grim picture of the broader situation across Kansas and the surrounding states. The Reaper organization had been larger than we'd realized, with multiple units operating across the region, and news of their defeat at our facility was spreading rapidly through survivor networks. Some of the radio traffic was encouraging. Communities that had been living in fear of Reaper attacks were celebrating our victory and expressing interest in establishing mutual support agreements. But other transmissions were more ominous, indicating that rival groups were moving to fill the power vacuum left by the Reaper's destruction. Our successful defense had eliminated one threat, but created opportunities for others to expand their territorial control. The psychological impact of our victory was profound but complicated. People felt pride in what we'd accomplished and relief that the immediate threat was over, but they were also traumatized by the violence they'd experienced and witnessed. Many of our community members had never been in physical confrontations before the Ice Age began, and now they'd participated in life-and-death combat that had left lasting emotional scars. Rodriguez and his crew began expanding our new living areas using hand tools and small equipment we'd managed to evacuate. The work was slow and difficult compared to the mining machinery we'd lost, but it was essential for creating sustainable long-term accommodations. Every additional square foot of living space reduced crowding and improved sanitation conditions that were crucial for preventing disease outbreaks in our confined environment. Food rationing became even more severe than it had been during the siege preparations. We were down to survival-level calories for everyone, including the children, and our hunting and foraging opportunities were virtually non-existent in the frozen surface world. I had to make the difficult decision to organize supply expeditions to the ruins of our original facility, hoping to recover resources from areas that hadn't been completely buried in the collapse. The supply recovery missions were dangerous and psychologically difficult for the teams involved. Returning to the collapsed tunnels where we'd lived for months and where our enemies had died was traumatic for everyone. But we managed to recover significant quantities of food, tools, and equipment from storage areas that had been protected from the worst effects of the explosion. These supplies bought us crucial time to develop more sustainable resource acquisition strategies. The surface conditions had continued to deteriorate during the weeks we'd spent fighting the Reapers. Radio reports indicated that temperatures were now consistently below freezing across the entire continental United States, with snow and ice accumulation reaching depths that made surface travel nearly impossible, except with specialized equipment. The volcanic winter was intensifying rather than moderating, suggesting that normal climate conditions might not return for years or even decades. Our salt reserves, which had been so valuable for trade relationships before the siege, were now mostly inaccessible in the collapsed sections of the original mine. We had salvaged several tons during our evacuation, but it wasn't enough to maintain the trading relationships that had been crucial for acquiring food and other supplies. I had to develop new strategies for economic relationships with other survivor communities, based on the resources and capabilities we still possessed. The tunnel connections to other underground facilities became our lifeline during this reconstruction period. Rodriguez had identified several passages that led to abandoned mining operations and storage facilities within a 5-mile radius of our new position. These connections had been sealed or flooded for decades, but with careful engineering work, they could be reopened to provide access to additional resources and alternative positions. Martinez established contact with the grain elevator community we traded with before the siege, and their response to our situation was more positive than I dared to hope. They had heard about our successful defense against the Reapers, and were interested in providing support to a community that had proven capable of resisting hostile takeover attempts. They needed our expertise in underground operations and were willing to share food supplies in exchange for technical assistance. The children adapted to our new circumstances with the same resilience they'd shown throughout the Ice Age crisis. Sophia and the other teenagers took on increased responsibilities for community maintenance and security, while the younger children continued their informal education using salvaged books and materials. Their psychological recovery from the siege trauma was faster than that of most adults, and their optimism helped maintain community morale during the difficult reconstruction period. Water management became a critical engineering challenge in our new location. The backup wells were functional, but had limited capacity compared to the main facility systems. We had to implement strict conservation measures and develop new distribution methods that could serve our population without overtaxing the available supply. Rodriguez designed gravity-fed systems that reduced our dependence on electric pumps and provided more reliable access to clean water. The mining equipment we'd salvaged during the evacuation proved invaluable for expanding and improving our new living areas. We had managed to save one small bulldozer and several hand-operated tools that allowed us to excavate additional chambers and improve ventilation throughout our secondary tunnel system. The work was slow and labor-intensive, but it was gradually creating the infrastructure necessary for long-term habitation. Security considerations remained paramount even after eliminating the Reaper threat. Other hostile groups were operating across the region, and our reputation as a successful defensive community made us both a valuable ally and a potential target. We established guard rotations and early warning systems adapted to our new tunnel layout, using lessons learned during the siege to create defensive positions that could protect our reduced population. The trading expedition to the grain elevator facility took place in early November, led by Martinez and Rodriguez, with a small team of our most experienced surface travelers. The journey was treacherous due to worsening weather conditions, but it was successful in establishing new resource exchange agreements that would help sustain our community through the winter months. We traded technical expertise and salvaged equipment for grain, preserved meat, and winter clothing. Radio communications brought news of a developing network of survivor communities across the central United States that were coordinating mutual support and defense agreements. Our successful resistance to the Reapers had earned us recognition as a significant player in this emerging alliance, and several communities were interested in establishing formal cooperation treaties that could benefit all parties involved. The psychological toll of leadership during this reconstruction period was immense. I was responsible for decisions that affected the survival and well-being of 91 people, including children who deserved better than the harsh world we were trying to navigate. The weight of that responsibility, combined with the trauma of the siege and the constant pressure of resource scarcity, was affecting my judgment and emotional stability in ways I struggled to manage. Food production became a priority as we realized that trading relationships alone wouldn't sustain our community indefinitely. We established underground growing areas using salvaged lighting equipment and seeds recovered from our original facility. The yields were modest, but they provided fresh vegetables that improved nutrition and morale while reducing our dependence on external food sources. The tunnel expansion project uncovered access to an abandoned salt storage facility that had been forgotten for decades. The discovery provided us with several hundred tons of high-quality salt that could be used for food preservation and trade relationships. It was a stroke of luck that significantly improved our economic prospects and our ability to acquire resources from other communities. Martinez made contact with a community of survivors who had established themselves in a large underground facility near Kansas City. They were interested in our expertise in tunnel operations and mining safety, and they had resources including medical supplies and technical equipment that we desperately needed. The distance between our communities made direct cooperation difficult, but radio coordination allowed us to share information and coordinate activities across the region. The weather reports from surface monitoring stations painted an increasingly bleak picture of global conditions. The volcanic winter was having effects far beyond North America, with crop failures and social collapse reported across Europe, Asia, and other continents. The ice age we were experiencing wasn't a local phenomenon. It was a global catastrophe that was reshaping human civilization on every inhabited continent. Our community's organizational structure evolved during the Reconstruction period to reflect the lessons we'd learned during the siege. Leadership responsibilities were distributed among several individuals with expertise in different areas, reducing the burden on any single person, while ensuring that critical decisions could be made quickly when necessary. The mining shift structure remained the foundation of our work organization, but it was adapted to address the broader range of survival activities we now needed to coordinate. The psychological recovery process was ongoing and complex, affecting different people in different ways depending on their experiences during the siege. Some individuals had been strengthened by the crisis and emerged as natural leaders and problem solvers. Others were struggling with trauma and depression that made it difficult for them to contribute effectively to community activities. Managing these diverse responses while maintaining unity and productivity was one of my most challenging responsibilities. December brought the first anniversary of the Yellowstone eruption and the beginning of the Ice Age. The radio commemorations and survivor testimonials from across the continent provided perspective on how much human society had changed during that single year. Governments had collapsed or been transformed beyond recognition. Billions of people had died from cold, starvation, and violence. The technological civilization that had seemed so permanent and robust had proven fragile when confronted with rapid climate change. Our community had not only survived that catastrophic year, but had evolved into something stronger and more resilient than the individual families and workers who had originally sought shelter in the mine. We had developed skills, relationships, and organizational structures that allowed us to thrive in conditions that had destroyed most other human settlements. The foundation we'd built during those first desperate weeks underground had proven capable of supporting us through challenges that would have seemed impossible to overcome. The trading network that emerged during the winter months connected dozens of survivor communities across the former United States, creating an informal economy based on resource exchange and mutual support. Our community became a regional hub for this network because of our central location, defensive capabilities, and expertise in underground operations. We were no longer just struggling to survive. We were participating in the early stages of rebuilding human civilization. The children who had been teenagers when the Ice Age began were now young adults with skills and experiences that would have been unimaginable in the old world. Sophia had become expert in radio communications, tunnel navigation, and community organization. Other young people had developed expertise in underground agriculture, mechanical systems, and defensive tactics. They were the foundation of whatever society would emerge from the Ice Age catastrophe. Radio contact with survivor communities as far away as Texas and Montana revealed that similar underground settlements were developing across the continent. Some were based in natural cave systems, others in abandoned mines like ours, and still others in subway tunnels and basement complexes in major cities. The common thread was that survival required going underground and developing new forms of social organization, adapted to harsh environmental conditions. The spring thaw that should have begun in March never came. Surface temperatures remained well below freezing, and snow accumulation continued to increase rather than melting. It was clear that the Ice Age conditions were not temporary weather patterns but fundamental changes to Earth's climate that could persist for decades or longer. Surface agriculture was impossible, and surface habitation was deadly except in the most protected circumstances. Our community's relationship with the surface world had fundamentally changed since our evacuation from the original mine facility. We still conducted supply raids and maintained contact with other communities, but our primary existence was entirely underground. The surface had become a hostile environment to be visited briefly when necessary, not a place where human beings could live and thrive. The network of tunnel connections that Rodriguez had been developing provided access to an area covering over 50 square miles of underground territory. We could travel, trade, and expand without ever exposing ourselves to surface conditions. It was the beginning of what would eventually become a subterranean civilization with its own transportation networks, economic systems, and cultural institutions. As we approached the end of our first 90 days in the new facility, I reflected on how much our understanding of survival and community had evolved since those first desperate nights when Yellowstone erupted. We had learned that technology and infrastructure were less important than human relationships and organizational skills. We had discovered that cooperation and mutual support were more valuable than individual resources or capabilities. The Ice Age had destroyed the world we knew, but it had also created opportunities to build something better adapted to the new realities we faced. Our community had become a model for other survivor groups, demonstrating that small-scale democratic organization could be more effective than authoritarian control for managing the complex challenges of post-catastrophe existence. The radio messages we received from other communities often asked for advice about organization, resource management, and defensive strategies. We had become teachers and mentors for other groups struggling with the same survival challenges we had overcome. The expertise we developed through trial, error, and desperate necessity was helping other communities avoid mistakes that could cost lives. Looking toward the future, I knew that our survival story was far from over. The Ice Age would continue for years or decades, and new challenges would emerge as resources became scarcer and competition between survivor groups intensified. But we had proven that human beings could adapt to almost any circumstances if they worked together and maintained their commitment to cooperation and mutual support. The mine that had been my workplace for 16 years had become the foundation for a new form of human society, adapted to a world that bore little resemblance to the one we'd lost. The skills I'd learned moving salt from underground deposits had evolved into the knowledge necessary for keeping dozens of families alive in the most challenging circumstances imaginable. Our children would grow up in a world where underground communities were normal, where cooperation was essential for survival, and where the surface of the earth was a dangerous frontier rather than humanity's natural home. They would have skills and perspectives that would allow them to rebuild civilization in ways that were more sustainable and resilient than what had existed before the catastrophe. The 90 days that began with the Reaper Siege and ended with our successful reconstruction had transformed our community from desperate survivors into confident builders of a new world. We had not only endured the challenges thrown at us, but had emerged stronger and more capable of facing whatever difficulties the future might bring.